I have the great honored day of doing a book review of Haddon Robinson's book, Making a Difference in Preaching. Haddon Robinson is one of my favorite preachers, so I was really looking forward to reading through this, and it was a great read. His book focuses on a central idea. How does one have authority in preaching today in a society where preachers are looked at as scam artists or get rich quick promoters or people who don't buy what they're selling? How does a preacher defy these expectations? Robinson splits up the book into three sections. The first of these is the preacher. The second of these is the preacher in their preaching. And the third of these are the preacher and people. In the first section, he focuses on theologians as evangelists, as one with authority, as one as a theologian, and he focuses on preacher herds. The second section is focusing on the preacher and their preaching. This is where he defines expository preaching, homiletics, hermeneutics, and application. Finally, in the third section, he focuses on the preacher and people. He discusses how a preacher has strengths in local congregation. And this is even against well-known preachers because a local preacher can speak to someone's individual situation better. We'll look at each section and summarize each. So let's look at the first section of the preacher. Robinson asks the question in the second chapter in this section. He asks, how do preachers have authority anymore? It's a valid question. Back in the good old days, preachers were seen as well-educated, knowledgeable, intelligent people. But things have changed today. Today, preachers are seen as ignorant, unknowledgeable about the world or anything outside of their four walls of the church. A preacher can just stick to communions, funerals, and weddings as far as the world is concerned. But Robinson says pastors can have authority even today in culture. How we do this is we speak for people before we ever try to speak to people. What this means is we express unexpressed feelings in people around us, especially when we preach. If we can articulate unexpressed feelings, then people will respond with a, yeah, that's right. That's my reaction too. Then if people know we understand the world and what is really going on, they'll listen to us again. This, of course, speaking for people is held in tension by Robinson, because a pastor is not only an evangelist. He's not only trying to recruit people and make it easy for them, because a pastor is also a theologian. He says this, evangelism without sound doctrine decays into ignorant fanaticism. Theology without the goal of making converts degenerates into cold intellectualism. So we have to learn to walk the line well as pastors. As we speak, we have to listen to the invisible congregation. We bring their questions, their needs, their doubts to the table as we prep a sermon. As we preach, we admit complexity, moral grayness, and tension we find between the text and the world. But at the same time, we are theologians. We must give people hope and encourage people to be better than they are. Finally, if a pastor displays the character they present as desirable in their sermons, if the pastor can make the presentation match the internal conviction, then they preach as one with authority. They're finally speaking for the people and not just to the people. This doesn't mean the preacher always paints things in just optimistic ways. The preacher has to preach with a limp sometimes, and this means preaching through sorrow and preaching through joy and preaching through pain. There's no faking it. Preachers are evangelists after all. And this is the first section of the book. In the second section of the book, Robinson outlines the preacher and their preaching. I see this as Robinson is teaching a preacher how to think and speak with the people, and not just speak to the people. We have to take Scripture seriously, and many of us know this, and we believe this. But what can happen because of this belief is that in our exposition, it only speaks to a time and place back then, in biblical times. But the biblical writers believe that preaching is God in action today. In other words, as we preach, God's doing something. We should then invite people into what God is doing today, not just what he did back then. To do this, we have to know our congregations. Robinson says we can exegete our congregations like we do the scriptures. We can then bring both of these exegeses together. And as we do this well, the line between the two will be blurred. We find the text being brought into the world and the world being brought into the text. And we should bring people along with us in this exegetical process. Robinson says, many modern hearers prefer to explore a subject and discover answers along with the preacher, rather than simply being told the conclusions. And although this sounds like a great and amazing process, it takes a lot of work from the preacher, if we're honest. Robinson suggests that the preacher has to take the language of the academy, Greek and Hebrew and theological discourse, and bring it down to the language of the marketplace. We have to be able to answer their questions, not just our own questions. We have to be more than just interesting speakers, because we have to speak with a sense of the eternal. We have to remove any intellectual snobbery we possess or maybe we put on, and we have to encourage people they can read scriptures and they too can see God in action. Further, we have to be willing to allow people to make their own applications of the scriptures and not just ones that we spell out for them. We have to be willing to take time to convince people of what the scriptures say and why the scriptures are true. Then, we are inviting people into a process, says Robinson, a process of God speaking, where they too may participate in this divine act. This is speaking with people and not just speaking to people. In the third section, after this, we can begin to speak to people. We have shown we have authority and we have proven our authority to the people. Now we can leave behind the we language in favor of you, says Robinson. This is the third section of the book. Robinson points out that we must not speak to a universal you, but a specific you. We speak to specific people in our congregation, maybe 2 to 4 people a week. If we do this, ironically, our preaching doesn't become less universal, but more universal. Why is this? Robinson suggests this is the case because people don't connect with ideas as much as they connect with people. People cannot easily walk up a ladder of abstraction ideas of language, theology, or eschatology. But people can connect with someone else's situation, even if that someone else is in the pew sitting next to them. And as they do this, they begin to think, yeah, I've been through that. Yeah, this relates to me too. We get specific when we speak to people because we know who they are and they know who we are. Other than this outline of the 3 sections, Robinson ends his book and offers some practical advice for the preacher that I think is important for us. He talks about in his sermon prep time, he has an imaginary table where he sits multiple people from his congregation every week. When he looks at certain passages of scripture, he asks, what would this naysayer in my church think about this? What would a teenager think of this? What would my biggest critic and supporter say? You can see that Robinson works on a sermon out loud most of the time. He's having conversations as he preps with people he knows in his congregation, even if they're imaginary. He literally says he does this out loud because he has specific people in mind. Sometimes he even breaks it open into a grid. I have a crude drawing of the grid. At the top are people in different situations. You have men, women, singles, married, divorced, people living together. On the side, you have different columns here. You have an aged person. So are they a teenager? Are they an elderly person? Are they middle-aged? You have profession. Are they self-employed? Are they unemployed? Where do they work? How do they work? Underneath this, you have levels of faith. Are they an atheist? Are they, charismatic? Are they fully committed to the church? Are they skeptical or cynical? And then we have bodily health. I would also encourage, spiritual health or mental health. Where do they sit? Do they have any needs in our congregation right now? And then as we look, we can see how a certain passage of scripture might intersect at some of these points. Maybe, a single unemployed person might really connect with this, or a married couple who's going through a lot of health issues right now. And then we can begin to see how we can speak specifically to someone's need in our congregation. We look for these intersections. Other than this, Robinson recommends working on sermons in 10-day cycles because this gives enough time and breadth to really think ahead and to polish. And if we're preaching from a sermon calendar, which is what else he recommends, then we can have more time to plan and think ahead. A final helpful practice Robinson mentions is that a preacher should take a whole year and dedicate that to a study of another preacher. They maybe should read their biography, their books, their sermons. If they have the ability, they can even watch their sermons. Then they can know what makes this certain preacher so great. And when they go to prep their own sermons, they can begin to ask, I wonder what John Wesley would think about this text or this sermon. I wonder what Haddon Robinson would think, and so on. Robinson, above all else, is the king of thinking visually. He can give examples, he can give parables and illustrations on par or better than many others can. He recommends this type in his preaching. And I understand from reading this book how well he employs that of thinking visually. This is a short read, it's around 150 pages. If you have the time, I would definitely give it a read through. Even just reading this, the way he writes, will certainly help us all as we preach. I promise.